Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Northern Virginia, where we're covering the National Training and Simulation Association's annual IFEST conference that focuses on, unsurprisingly, training and simulations. And we have with us Dr. Schatz, who is the director of the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative at the Pentagon, answering directly to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's a mouthful, right?
It very much is a mouthful, and also I want to compliment you as a guy with a name like Vago, compliment you on a name like which is very cool. Tell us a little bit about how the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative, how it works, how it interfaces with military services that have their own ideas about training, some of which they are tried and tested. But there is a degree of coordination, but not as much formal coordination. We heard that from Major General Deal, that his role on the Joint Staff is to try to bring some of that together. Talk to us about your role in this entire training and simulation ecosystem.
Sure. So the ADL initiative existed back from the 90s, when this whole idea of internet-based learning was brand new. And there were all these little pockets of excellence that were coming up everywhere, in the National Guard, in all the different services, and across the whole government. And so at that time, the government realized, wow, we really need to have a way that we can unify across these so that the systems don't become siloed efforts, and so that we can really make sure that we're delivering the highest quality distributed learning to people that we can, anytime, anywhere. And so the ADL initiative was stood up. Now, we're in the Department of Defense. We report up through the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Education and Training. But our mandate is actually whole of government. And so really our job is to make sure that government across the federal government, DoD too, the industry, academia, and the specs and standards organizations are all talking to each other so that we can create systems that are as efficient and effective as possible.
I also should say that ADL is a co-partner. You guys are partnered with the National Training and Simulation Association in order to make this conference possible, and you have a number of folks who are expert speakers. Talk to us a little bit about the technological changes. I remember SimNet when it was first born back in those days, covering it, and it was such a dramatic change from everything that had gone before. Not to say that the Defense Department hasn't always been interested in distributed learning systems, but that was sort of one of the big breakthroughs, that you could have tanks at various training centers, and even though it was very, very primitive graphics, you could still get and practice gunnery and tactics. Talk to us a little bit about where the technology is going, because in one of the panel discussions yesterday, you guys were talking about how rapidly things are changing right now. Talk to us about some of those rapid technological changes and where that's going to put military training in a few years.
Well, I really think that we're moving to this idea of a learning ecosystem. So even when you talk about the days of SimNet, it was still this idea of siloed episodic learning. And it was still kind of the one-size-fits-all, or maybe one-size-fits-none sort of learning, right? And it was in this industrialized model. Now, that's not to disparage things, because that was the state of the art. But today, I think we're moving away from this idea of this episodic, industrialized model to a much more enmeshed model, where it's hyper-personalized to what individual learners or teams need, that it's considering those aspects, context, different devices that people have. I like to have the analogy of blended learning back previously, maybe even today, is kind of the way that maybe a picky toddler's meal looks, right? Where you have the different pieces of learning content, but they're separated by these little barriers. Okay, they're kind of next to each other. Maybe they're even touching. We're starting to get into the salad phase, where things are starting to be mixed together a little bit. But I think that the near future, is the green smoothie phase, where everything is so blended up that you don't really have this sense of, oh, I'm in a training event, oh, I'm in an education event, oh, now I'm going to go to operations, but it's all around you. It's kind of moving the idea of distributed learning from anytime, anywhere, to every time, everywhere, pervasive, around us all the time. So what are the big trends when we get to that, right? So it's certain things like, well, we're going to have learning available to us all the time, necessarily because we need that access to continuous learning, to continuous knowledge. We're going to have not just knowledge that's developed from the top down, but social knowledge, right? So it's peer-to-peer as well as this kind of formalized. So it's the informal learning and capitalizing on that. It's also necessarily data-driven learning, which incidentally is the theme for iFest, because without that high quality data and without being able to know exactly what somebody needs, what the quality of the content is, where they are, what devices they have, we can't get to that personalized, hyper-efficient outcome that we're looking for. The last bit, of course, and this is particularly relevant if you're a super geek like many of the folks here.
And many of our viewers as well, but in a very, very good way.
That's right, exactly. So how are all the mechanisms that make this work? And that comes down to things like the interoperability specifications, the data protocols like XAPI that make the data interoperable across these different systems, the cybersecurity, the privacy settings associated with that, the competencies and credentialing that are necessary to be able to encode and shore these different data pieces across systems. And that's what a lot of this event is about.
When you mentioned data-driven, I should have mentioned that as well, but you guys also made the point yesterday that you have to know exactly what you want to get from this massive data, right? I want to get to that. But first I want to ask you, how do the services have to change how they think? How does the military have to change how it thinks about training in an environment where the fidelity of that synthetic training can be almost as good for many applications as the real thing, particularly if you're looking at, to a degree, whether it's on the naval side and on the air side, you're already starting to get to that degree of fidelity. The complication has certainly been much more on the ground combat side. We're getting that, the raw fidelity, the heat, and everything else is a little bit harder. But tell us how folks have to change how they think about training as opposed to just taking this technology and plugging it into the model that we have today.
So we already have the best trained and educated armed forces in the entire world. But the world around us is moving so rapidly, and it's becoming increasingly volatile. The general, when he spoke yesterday, Major General Deal from the Joint Staff, he talked about how we have all of these challenges we're going to have to face around us. Mega cities, the increasingly sophisticated technologies that are now available to everyone off of the shelf, the global politics that are shifting, the contested spaces like cyberspace and real space, and all of these other things that are going on around us. And so what does this really mean for our military personnel? It means that they have to become these lifelong learners that are continuously learning and relearning and unlearning. The pace of that kind of knowledge is just astronomical. Add to that you have artificial intelligence and automation that are taking the easy jobs, and I use quotes because of course they're not easy, but that's pushing people to what Kim Peretti, our Adobe keynote yesterday, talked about, the human skills, and really putting the spotlight on those things like judgment and intuition and creative thinking and strategic thinking. And so it's creating a need for those much more sophisticated knowledge, skills, and abilities. So all of that together means that our personnel need a wider range of knowledge, skills, attitudes, abilities, whatever word you want to use there, at a much more sophisticated level, and that are refreshed more and more frequently. Our current system is not set up to meet those needs. So even though it's the best today, we have to continue to evolve it.
Everybody's trying to do more with less.
Yeah.
There's a hope that the defense budget goes up, but there are a lot of folks who say the defense budget may not go up as much as everybody thinks. Training has been a challenge. We've seen that in whether it's accident rates on the aviation side. We've seen that each one of the services have sort of complained to a degree that we're not getting as much training done as we can. What's the role of some of these synthetic environments to help make up that difference? And is there a projected savings number, especially as the fidelity goes up? As somebody who looks at this, is there an X percentage out there that can be potentially saved that can then be redirected, whether it's to weapons or to operations or to training, more physical training, that is still going to be something that's absolutely required of everybody?
Sure, absolutely. I think that high quality training and education does give you immediate benefits, just like you were saying, right? So if I use a simulator versus I use, a real aircraft, I'm going to save money immediately. But there's also a hidden cost or a hidden savings. So if I have a more highly trained crew, they're able to put those munitions on target more efficiently, so they end up with less waste. If I have a better trained radio operating crew, they're able to troubleshoot their systems and get more life out of them. If I have a better trained tank crew, they're better able to use that vehicle safely and have less damage on it. And so, yes, delivery of high quality training and education has these immediate efficiencies, but also these longer term ones for our entire force.
So what are the ways that the services have to change how they think about training, right?
Okay.
You said that folks have to change, that it's the best training system in the world, but that folks have to change the way that they think. How do they have to change? And what is your recommendation for how they should be thinking differently and what they should be doing differently in this new environment where you have all of these technological enablers, some of which are remarkably inexpensive, right? I mean, it's the Samsung $100 thing that holds the iPhone up to your head to give you that 3D capability. What are some of the ways that the services have to change how they think?
Well, and I think that the services are already starting to move these directions. In fact, if you looked across every single service, right now there are strategic documents out there that are pointing towards this need for innovation. So what are the kinds of innovations that we need to do? We need to get away from this idea of time-based episodic learning, whether that be in a classroom, on a training range, in a simulator, or whatever. We need to start thinking about how do we break apart that training and education, deliver what can be delivered at the point of need, as job aids or information guides. Figure out how to personalize it across different devices. Figure out how to make best use of those expert instructors. So where can computers or distributed learning, e-learning, mobile learning come into play? And I think if we take a look at the whole system, we can find a lot of savings like that.
You talked about big data and its role in training and improving training, but the whole key that all of you said was you have to know exactly what it is you're looking for. Otherwise, you're just asking for a nightmare because you have all this massive amount of data and you really don't have a plan. You don't have an idea of what you need. What's the best way to apply big data to these training problems and to think through, I suppose it's thinking through exactly what the problem is that you need to solve, right? I mean, talk to us a little bit about how to harness big data, the challenges, but also the opportunities and the mental architecture you need to go into doing that.
So I like the term that Kim Peretti, our Adobe keynote, used yesterday. She talked about data exhaust, right? There's all of this big data out there, and if we just try to grab it all, it's just a bunch of exhaust. Like, it's just data out there. We need to find those kernels that are really useful for us. So how do we do that? Well, two things, right? You have to understand the problem. If you just go out and go fishing for data, I mean, yeah, maybe you'll find something, but you're probably just going to get distracted quite a bit. So what's the question? And really understanding that well, and let's be driven, problem focused in trying to understand that. The second thing to understand is, what's the purpose of data? The purpose of data is to give us insights. And so we really want to think about what's the decision we're trying to give insights into, and realize that as long as we have enough data to help that decision maker make a good decision, that's sufficient. We don't necessarily need to have hyper precision that we can, put this into an academic journal and get a certain p-value. What we need to have is good quality insights for our decision makers so that the system can move forward. Now, those decision makers may be automation, right? Those decision makers may be AI classifiers, but if we approach it from that very pragmatic angle, I think that will be very effective.
Oh, wait a minute. One last question. Of all the technology, and there was a lot of technology out there, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, how do you know what's the good technology and what you really need and what you really don't need, right? Because the companies are in the business of selling, and that's what they're supposed to do. But with all of this proliferation of interest in this fast-moving space, how does the government work through sifting what it actually needs from what it might think is interesting, but actually doesn't really help solve any of your problems.
Well, I certainly couldn't speak for the whole government and how they do it, but I could say that from my own personal perspective, just like you said, there is a wide range of technology that's moving very rapidly. So I think start small and start with the basics. When people come to me and they say, well, what's the first thing that I should do to improve my distributed learning? I say, look at your instructors or your instructional designers. Improve the quality of what they do, through pedagogy or andragogy, through learning science. Well, that's not a technology. Yeah, but you know what? It has a huge impact. Okay, what's the next step? Well, I don't know. Use your cell phone and make some personalized videos, just like you said. There's a whole variety of open source technologies as well. Well, then when do you start incorporating things like virtual reality and augmented reality and all these other cool things? Well, there is a time and a place for those. But let's be driven by what the content needs are and what the level of learning that's needed, and start small and start inexpensively with what's available already before that.
And be willing to fail, to do something.
That's it.
And
yeah, well, right, and this is what the general said yesterday in the keynote. He said we need to embrace innovation in the Department of Defense even more so than we do today, right? And that does mean a willingness to be able to try and fail, but fail fast. Fail with something quick and easy that we can prototype, get it out there, see what works, fix the places that don't work, and then try it again.
Dr. Schatz, the director of the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative at DoD, thanks so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.